Good morning and welcome to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. And as probably many of you know, we no longer meet physically at the Marxist Library, the Neville Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California. We've been meeting mostly since the pandemic on Zoom. So good morning to everybody on the Pacific time zone, but our speaker is in Connecticut. Good afternoon and good evening to others who may be in other time zones. We now have participants from all over the country joining us, and we're very happy to do that. We've been doing these programs for a decade and a half, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, and it's been a platform for diverse presentations on a variety of topics such as political economy, the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism and militarism, resisting racial and gender injustice. But you don't have to be a Marxist, definitely not to be a participant, either as a speaker or to join our Sunday morning programs. However, we, the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, and I'm a member of the program committee. My name is Roger Harris, the ICSS. We are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that work remains relevant today. We take our tagline from the motto that Karl Marx wrote in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, quote, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." And you could sign up for email notifications for future programs, view past programs, and contact us through our website. And our website is ICSSmarx.org. And we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics, speakers, etc. Before we start, I wish to remind everyone that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. And as such, we ask that you show respect for other participants, the moderator, and the speaker. And please note the opinions expressed here are that of the speaker and the participants. They do not necessarily reflect either the ICSS program committee or the Marxist Library itself. Today's program will be about 45 minutes presentation, and that will be followed by a short break of announcements, and then we'll have a robust Q&A, and we hope to end at around 12:30 Pacific time. The topic for our discussion today is Ceasefire Korea, the tragic split and its contemporary implications. And our speaker, very proud and honored to introduce our speaker, who is Mark Albertson. Mark is a regular participant at Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. He is a frequent presenter and a very, very accomplished speaker. He is logged in hundreds of appearances on the air and has a commanding knowledge of geopolitics. He is the historical research editor at Army Aviation Magazine and is the historian for the Army Aviation Association of America. He has authored several books, and these include the USS Connecticut, subtitled Constitution State Battleship. Another book is They'll Have to Follow You, The Triumph of the Great White Fleet. And he also wrote on history, a treatise, which he's working on a 2-volume history of the saga of the Army Aviation. Mark teaches history at Norfolk Community College in Norfolk, Connecticut. Welcome, Mark, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you all for tuning in. Yeah, this is actually July 27 is the 70th anniversary date, but we're still in 2023, so that's 1953. Of what was signed on July 27, 1953 was not a ceasefire. It was not a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire. So technically that war is still on. And I've interviewed a lot of Korean War veterans, and they bristle at a couple of things here. Number one, they bristle at this notion that this was a police action and not a war. They also bristle when they hear some journalist, or they're listening, or they're watching television, or they read in the newspapers that Afghanistan is America's longest running war. And so they bristle at this lack of knowledge of history. In fact, you begin to wonder how many people remember how long was the white man fighting the Seminole Indians, or how long were the Apache and Comanche wars going on in the days of the westward expansion. But Korea itself is a tragedy. And Korea itself is a tragedy from the perspective, number one, geographically where it is. I mean, you've got China on one side, a sliver of Russia on another, and to the south you got Japan. Boy, that's a place you want to live. However, having said that, in the modern era, it's been particularly tough. If you go back to 1945, with the defeat of the Axis powers, you can understand why fascist Italy was occupied by the victorious Allied armies, or Nazi Germany itself. And Nazi Germany was divided into four pieces of a pie: the Soviet zone, the French zone, British zone, and American zone. However, the Japan, interestingly enough, will be occupied, but by the United States solely. The United States would not allow anyone else to take part in that occupation. And that's not an accident. In fact, when you lump Japan together with Korea, you will find Korea points like a knife blade at the heart of Japan. That's one of the reasons the Japanese, when they become an empire, want it in the first place. You're eliminating that threat of that knife blade pointing at your heart, but at the same time, reverse it. It can also be a jump off point onto the Asian mainland, and that's exactly what Japan's going to do. But the tragedy here is after 1945. Italy, Germany, and Japan are occupied, but why Korea? Was Korea an Axis power? No, Korea was not an Axis power. Korea is going to be the butt of contention here in post-1945 politics. Remember, I've said this before in a number of other talks, there is no World War I or World War II. There's only one war here, the Great War, 1914, 1922, not 1918, and then 1931, 1945. And the essence of this conflict is, by 45, the Europeans no longer dominate the world. There are two powers who win this conflict in the end, because they were the most industrially endowed, they were crawling with oil, and they had large populations to replace losses in man's greatest industrialized conflict: capitalist war, corporatized war, and this commercialized war, total war in the modern era. And that's the United States and the Soviet Union. That's the United States. But now you are seeing a new balance of power contention here. And this happens time in, time out. This seems to be human nature. Man. And this contention is the balance of power politics that are going to be played by Moscow and Washington. It's that simple. And you're going to divide Korea. Keep in mind here, the United States does not want a Korea dominated by Russia. Russia does not want a Korea dominated by the United States. And later on in 1949, once Mao Zedong has defeated Chiang Kai-shek for control of China, he's not going to want a U.S. dominated Korea on the Yalu River. And that's going to be significant in this conflict. That is going to be a big bone of contention here in Washington, D.C., when the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Paul Nietzsche, and other influential types want to invade North Korea after they kick the NKPA out of South Korea. And George Kennan's going to say, no, we're going to get into that. But Korea's problems itself, go back to the 19th century when Japan begins to rise as a power. And they're gonna bring in the Germans to train a new army. They're going to bring the British to train a navy. Boy, how good does this get? And they're going to put their strategic initiatives to work here. In 1894, they're going to go to war with China. This is called the Sino-Japanese War. And the bone of contention here is going to be Korea, the Yellow Sea, the Liaotung Peninsula, Port Arthur. And the Japanese take all of these. And they even threaten Peking, and the Chinese sue for peace. They have to give up Korea, the Liaotung Peninsula, Port Arthur. The Japanese are going to get the Pescador Islands, and they're also going to get a large indemnity. That's what you did back then, back in those days. You paid a large indemnity if you lost. Now, what's that indemnity do? You're paying for the expenses of the victor, besides paying the expenses of your own for losing. So the idea is not to lose. But however, Japan is looking to get into this club of imperialist powers, which are dominated by white Christian Europeans. And they don't want Japan here. They don't, these people, Japan, these people have round heads, yellow skin, and slanted eyes. There goes the neighborhood. We don't want them here. And so France, Germany, and Tsarist Russia are going to drop their differences in the competition for colonies and force Japan out. Now, Japan is going to be incensed. And between 1897 and 1902, they are going to add 4 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 23 destroyers to the Imperial Japanese Navy, most of which are built by Britain, because Britain will sign an alliance with the Japanese in 1902 against Russia, and they're going to sign another one in 1905 once the Japanese dispatch the Russians against Germany. But Japan's going to give it another go in the 1945 Russo-Japanese War. And they're going to defeat the Russians, and the world is shocked. An Asiatic power beat a European power. Again, the globe is changing. Not only did the Japanese beat the Russians, not only did they get Korea, but they served as a spur for people like Sun Yat-sen, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and others who were looking to rid themselves of European colonialism. The Japanese served as this model. And again, the Japanese are going to deal the British a big blow in early 1942 when they took the fortress of Singapore. That was a big embarrassment for the British. Big embarrassment for the British. However, having said that, interesting little side note here about Korea. In 1936, the Berlin Games, the Japanese are going to annex Korea in 1910. But during the Berlin Games in 1936, there were Korean athletes performing here in the Olympic Games, but they weren't representing Korea. They had the Japanese flag on their shirts because why? They are part of the Japanese Empire. Interesting, if you've seen some of the interviews with some of these athletes before they died, very much disgruntled here, representing Japan and not their own country. However, by 1945, the Japanese will be utterly defeated and they'll be kicked out of Korea, among other places that they took. However, the United States is not going to allow anyone else to dominate or even occupy Japan. We are not going to make the same, if you want to use the term, mistake we made in Europe. Because that's one of the reasons, one of the reasons you're going to have the bombs drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is because they want to put an end, they want to put an end to the war against Japan so that the Soviets don't gobble up more of Asia. That's one of the major reasons for the bombs. It's political every bit as much as it's military. And here you're going to see, though, the United States and Russia begin to sit down and decide how are we going to divide the Korean Peninsula up? Now, a man that comes to mind here is Dean Rusk, and I'm sure you all know who he was. He was in the Johnson administration. He was in the Kennedy administration. He was also in the Truman administration. And he talks about the discussions going on here between the United States and the Soviet Union as to where they're going to divide the 38th parallel. Come to find out, the 38th parallel will be the dividing line. But Dean Rusk said, and I saw this interview, it's fascinating. He said the State Department historians missed it, Army historians missed it, that the 38th parallel was discussed by the Japanese and the Russians in 1904. And Dean Rusk said, if we knew that, we never would have agreed to the 38th parallel. So it kind of opens your eyes when the 38th parallel is mentioned. The Russians aren't gonna really put up much of a dispute. Sure, that sounds fine. That sounds fine. But this is where the country's divided. Now, in the South, the United States is going to install Syngman Rhee. Now, Syngman Rhee is no Democrat. Syngman Rhee is along the same lines as Chiang Kai-shek, the guys to the right of center. He's no Democrat. He's not really for people's rights. I mean, deep down, he's not. Up north, though, it'll be Kim Il-sung. Now, let's understand something. Something important happens here. Kim Il-sung, with the formation of the North Korean army, the formation of the South Korean army, Kim Il-sung has an advantage right away. Of the 190,000 men in the North Korean army as of June 25, 1950, 60,000 of these gentlemen had already had very, very ardent combat experience in China. First, with fighting with Mao against the Japanese invaders in China, and again against the Chinese nationalist armies during the Chinese Civil War. They had a lot of combat experience. Now, the United States, the army they're backing, the South Korean army, has no such combat experience. And this is going to prove decisive at the outset of this war. On top of that, the United States will not send Syngman Rhee many tanks. They're not going to send him many heavy pieces of artillery. They are not going to send him many aircraft. They don't trust their satrap. They know he would like nothing better than to cross the 38th parallel and unite the peninsula under his banner. Stalin does the opposite. Stalin actually sends Kim Il-sung 150 T-34 tanks. If you're familiar with that tank, it was the best tank made by any Allied power during what we call the Second World War. And it's the most mass-produced tank in history. During the war and after the war, the Soviets made over 84,000 of this type. During the war, they made 54,550 of them. The Sherman is second at 49,249. Although by comparison, the Sherman tank was a Purple Heart box. The British used to call it the Ronson Lighter. One hit and up it went. It had a gasoline engine. But the T-34 that Stalin sent the North Korean army had sloped sides, sloped armor, so a shell would hit it and bounce off, had a diesel engine to cut down on the fire hazard, had 19-inch tracks that would go through any terrain another tank could not go through, and simplicity. All right, the fit and finish, it's Russian. It's not all that great. But let me tell you something. You have a pair of pliers and a wrench set, you keep that thing running 20 years. Very simple. And on top of that, it's a rough ride, but it's made for factory workers and peasants. What do they know about Duesenbergs, right? What do they know about that? But on June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung crosses the 38th parallel. He's going to unite the peninsula under his banner. Right off the bat, they run right through the South Korean army. They take Seoul, the capital of South Korea, lickety-split. The UN has to get together and discuss if they're going to send an army here or not of UN forces. The day of the voting, the Soviets are absent. The Soviets are absent, and the vote passes decidedly. They are gonna support the South Korean army. Upwards of 25 countries are going to send troops here. 25. The United States, Britain, France, the Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, so on and so forth. Even the Turks sent troops here as part of a United Nations force. However, there isn't much that the United States can send here in the beginning. Let's understand something here. This is the United States Army of 1950. This is not the United States Army of 1945. And many of the men they're going to send are on garrison duty in Japan. Now, many of these guys are half-trained. They're 18, 19, 20 years old. You put your time in Japan, you have a good time, and you go home. No one said anything about Korea. And so they send this scratch force to Korea. It's 500 men. It's called Task Force Smith, named after the commander. They're going to try to stop the North Korean juggernaut near Daejeon, halfway down the South Korean end of the peninsula. And they are up against an army that has been blooded in China. And this task force does not have much in the way of tanks, heavy guns. It's a scratch force. They have bazookas. And the North Korean army goes through this force like a hot knife through butter. Of 500 men, 250 are killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The UN forces will continue to retreat toward the port of Pusan, which is in the southeast coast of South Korea. Here they set up a perimeter, end of July, August, into September, and they hold out. Supplies are constantly coming in now from Japan, which is not all that far away from Korea. However, General Douglas MacArthur is the commander-in-chief of UN forces, and he has an inspired plan here. That plan is to land troops on the northwest corner of South Korea at a place called Incheon. And what he does here, interestingly enough, he brings in Japanese ship pilots from the Japanese Imperial Navy from World War II, which he's not supposed to do, but he does it anyway. And they will guide American ships through the treacherous waters of Incheon and land the Marines. Once the Marines are landed, the North Korean army has to make the dash north now to the 38th parallel to escape. The problem here is, and I find this a problem with MacArthur, they get out of Incheon and they head right for Seoul. You know, the MacArthur wants to put Syngman Rhee back on the seat right away. What they should have done is gone lickety-split across the entire width of South Korea to the East Coast and cut off the escape route of the North Korean army. He failed to do that. 30,000 North Koreans escaped the net to join the remainder of the North Korean army above the 38th parallel. Then the number one priority should have been to get to that East Coast. And when you shut off the escape route, then annihilate that army. They didn't do that. But now the discussion starts. And this is a meaty part of this. Do we cross the 38th parallel, or do we not cross the 38th parallel? MacArthur is gung-ho to cross the 38th parallel. His agenda here is to eliminate the communist government in North Korea and also to enlist the support of Chiang Kai-shek and get rid of Mao in Peking, even if we have to use nuclear weapons. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff support MacArthur in crossing the 38th parallel. Truman supports this, but not getting into a war with China. He does not want that. We're going to unite the peninsula and call it a day. However, Paul Nietzsche, now this is where it gets a little dicey here. George Kennan was the first director of policy planning when we revamped our government in 1947. He was the director of policy planning for the State Department from 1947, 1949. But he's going to make some pronouncements. You know, George Kennan is probably one of the most fascinating policymakers of the entire 20th century for the United States. This is a man who, for the most part, taught himself 7 languages. This is a man whose parents, his father, when he sent him to Princeton, this is a kid that comes out of Milwaukee. What does he know about Ivy League schools? And he hated going to Princeton. He said half the student body here are a bunch of spoiled rich brats. Hated going here. But he's an extremely intelligent individual. And as policy planner, he also helped. He was co-author of the Marshall Plan. And he was an extremely intelligent, he was the one that came up with that policy of containment. We don't want to have another war like we did in 1914 and 1939. He said, squeezed in between is the Depression. How many shocks can the globe take? We don't want a large war. With containment, he professes that we have the world's greatest economy. That is our trump card. Number two, he said, we don't want to engage the Soviets in an arms race. We'll ruin the economy. He also says, if we use our intelligence properly and we use our propaganda properly, we can contain the Soviets without a major war. He was also against having, forget spreading NATO east, he was against having NATO in the first place. He said, you're only going to get a Soviet response. What shows up by 1953? The Warsaw Pact. He was right. But Paul Nietzsche, with National Security Council paper number 68, and it's an interesting paper to read, it's 66 pages. He goes beyond Kennan. He has a more militaristic foreign policy than Kennan does. Kennan does not want a militaristic foreign policy. He's in league with people like Charles Bolin, who agrees with him. These are considered some of the wise men. But not Nietzsche. Nietzsche agrees we should cross the 38th parallel. Kennan urges President Truman, do not cross the 38th parallel. Once you've kicked the North Korean army out of South Korea, you stop here. That's called containment. He says, besides, he told Truman this, don't listen to Douglas MacArthur. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's what he told him. Truman will push aside Kennan's remarks and push north. And Kennan said, you're going to bring the Chinese into the war because you're closing in on the Chinese border. You'll bring Red China into the war. That's what he said. And sure enough, as UN forces are closing in going up the North Korean countryside, what are they saying? Don't come near the Yalu River. Don't come near the Yalu River. And sure enough, the UN forces are going up the North Korean countryside in two spearheads. One to the right is 10th Corps. A lot of that's made up of Marines with some US troops. To the left is 8th Army. That's US Army forces plus UN troops. But they are not mutually supporting. This is a mistake in military tactics. These two columns are not mutually supporting. In late October 1950, the Chinese launch a spoiling attack against a lead South Korean army unit and bloody the nose. This is a warning. Don't come near the border. MacArthur avoids this warning. Truman is concerned. And MacArthur assures him, we have superior air power. We can blunt anything the Chinese send. The decisive day here is the night of November 25, 26, 1950. Now this is Thanksgiving, and the Chinese insert 300,000 volunteers. Now, understand the situation here. Those winds are coming out of Manchuria and the temperature is dropping like a rock. The UN forces, Americans included, the UN forces are mechanized. Trucks, tanks, jeeps. They are consigned to the few roads available. North Korea has a horrible road network. Most of all the roads are dirt. They're not paved. How do you think these roads are after a rain or melted snows and ice? We are making the same mistake Hitler made in 41. 95% of Soviet roads were not paved. They were dirt. And they don't have a railroad. We can't move stuff by trains here, trains of any consequence, so you can't use that. The Chinese are moving by the oldest form of mobility man has ever used. Their feet. This is how they beat the Japanese. This is how they beat the Chinese Nationalist Army of Chiang Kai-shek. And they're controlling the countryside because there's nothing to stop them. Most UN troops are on the roads, and the Chinese are cutting off the roads, and they're launching ambushes as the UN forces retreat. And the temperatures are going down to 20, 25, 30 below zero. And they're going to push. In fact, General Oliver P. Smith here, the Marine commander, is questioned by a journalist who says, I thought Marines didn't retreat. And General Smith says, we're not retreating, we're fighting in a different direction. Now, there is some truth to that because they're fighting the Chinese ambushes, but they're going south, they're not going north. And so the Chinese are able to push the UN back down to the 38th parallel, over the 38th parallel. MacArthur's going to be fired because Truman's going to use the rationale here that what MacArthur's trying to do here is void civilian control of the military. Well, you know, MacArthur had an ego bigger than my house, for Pete's sakes. And so he's fired. And there's a competent general put in his place, Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway reorganizes UN forces. This is February 1951, pushes the Chinese back above the 38th parallel. Once his supply lines are stretched out, the Chinese reorganize, push the UN forces back down below the 38th parallel. Ridgway reorganizes the UN and pushes them back up to the 38th parallel. The capital city of South Korea, Seoul, changed hands 4 times in this war. 4 times it changed hands. But here something happens. In an era of developing push-button warfare, drones are coming on, atomic warfare, it develops into a stalemate, trench warfare. In the spring of 1951, both sides are digging trenches. You are seeing a repeat of 1914. And this war will remain this way for the next 2 years and 3 months. Stalemate. It will be a constant battle between Chinese manpower and Western technology. That's what's going to happen. The war winds up as a stalemate. Now, fascinating here, too, are the discussions that begin in 1952. In 1952, at the Panmunjom along the 38th parallel, you know, the discussions between the Chinese and North Koreans and the United States and the UN. Now, what I found fascinating about this, generally, in the beginning here, and you can catch photos of this, in the beginning here, of these discussions, you know, generally, people from the West are taller than people from Asia. In fact, you can even see them when they're sitting down. The Westerners are sitting up like this. The Orientals are sitting down like this. This did not go well with the Chinese and the North Koreans. So some of the seats that were used by the UN here, the legs had to be cut down. So later photos, you would see them more or less sitting at the same height here. God forbid we have superiority here. But these talks go on until 1953. However, one of the biggest bones of contention are prisoners. The UN has captured many more prisoners than China and North Korea. And the Chinese want them all back. This got to be a big bone of contention. And they're going to be told by the UN negotiators, we can't force them back. If they want to stay, they can stay. Many will go back, but not all of them. Of course, the other side of the coin, some of these guys who were captured up north were brainwashed, but very few were. Many were returned as they were captured. Although the North Koreans were a lot rougher than the Chinese were. Why? Well, it's their country they're talking about, right? And weren't the Vietnamese that way? Let's understand something. When the British were here, the American colonists, we'll call them patriotic colonists, how do you think they treated some of the British and Tories and loyalists? You ought to read some of those accounts. You know, man is man. Let's understand this. And so on July 27, 1953, a ceasefire is signed. The shooting stops, but the war is not over. But that's not the only important thing about this entire situation. There was another war going on here, folks. Ho Chi Minh is trying to throw the French out of North Vietnam. That war was longer than the Korean War. And by 1954, and this has to be added here to get together, to really put together a picture here. You know, keep in mind, Korea, the shooting stopped July 27, 1953. So the memories of this are still fresh. But in March to May 1954, the French paratroopers are going to be surrounded at Dien Bien Phu. There's 15,000 of them here. And they're going to be surrounded by a 55,000-man Vietminh army. Now, let's understand something about the Vietminh. They began as a guerrilla unit. This began as an insurgency. It is no longer just an insurgent army. This is a good, conventional, well-trained army, all under the auspices of Vo Nguyen Giap, who's a brilliant general here. He really is. The French are screaming for help. They want the United States to help them. We are already helping them. The U.S. taxpayer has already been in Vietnam long before the soldier was. In fact, believe it or not, from the end of 1953 into 1954, the U.S. taxpayer spent $1.063 billion here in North Vietnam. We were paying 77% of the French freight here. That's astounding. That really is. However, a plan is hatched here by some of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They don't want North Vietnam to fall to Ho Chi Minh because they've already lost North Korea. That war ended in a stalemate. We don't want to see the West defeated here again. And it's Nathan Twining, United States Joint Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, Arthur Radford, Chief of Staff of the United States Navy, and they have a plan here called Operation Vulture. Now, keep in mind, Eisenhower's the president now, not Truman. And in this plan, they are going to launch 60 B-29s from the Philippines, escorted by 150 Navy carrier fighters. And they're going to saturate bomb the North Vietnamese troops surrounding the French. It's even brought up, how about low-level nukes here? The man who's against this, the Joint Chief of Staff of the Army, Matthew Ridgway, the same man I mentioned just a few minutes ago who took over from MacArthur in Korea, he is against this. He tells Eisenhower, he knows Eisenhower from World War II when Eisenhower was a general, and he tells him, he says, hey, Ike, if you want to get involved here, it's going to cost 7 divisions. If the Chinese get involved, and he said China will get involved in this, it's going to cost 12 divisions. And on top of that, you need to send men to NATO to offset the Warsaw Pact, because that's already started. That's already started. And he told Ike, you're the one who wants to reduce the U.S. Army. And Eisenhower will here, folks. When the Korean War was over with, the United States Army had 20 divisions. By 1957, it will have 14. The Navy will be reduced. The only service that was not reduced but was added to was the United States Air Force. And Eisenhower says, he says, if we use nuclear weapons, we'll have to deny it for 20 years. But he says this entire amount of wrangling is not getting us anywhere. And he says, nobody's going anywhere unless I get consideration from Congress. And you know what that means? He wants a declaration of war. And Congress is not going to give him one. And so we won't go into North Vietnam. In fact, who is the Senate leader here in Congress in 54? A man who later becomes president, Lyndon Johnson, who says, get involved in North Vietnam? Why would we want to do that for? And another man, another young man from Massachusetts in Congress, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who says, get involved in Vietnam. Why would we want to do that for? And so according to the West, the world is getting to look a little dour here. You know, the Soviets blew a bomb in 1949. North Korea became what they call communist. In 1953, the war to liberate North Korea wound up where it started off here at the 38th parallel. Vietnam is now split at the 17th parallel. The Soviets have blown a hydrogen bomb in 1953. And when you get into this a little bit here, Gamal Abdel Nasser asked the West for arms in 1953. They said no. So where is he getting his arms from? He petitioned Czechoslovakia, which was given the green light by Moscow, and now they're getting arms from the East Bloc in 1954. Interesting what's happening here with regards to going around the Korean situation. Although one thing, and I'll end with this, one thing positive did come out of the Korean War for the United States in particular: the helicopter. Remember the show MASH? Remember those little helicopters with the glass bulbous front to it? That's a Bell H-13. What you saw on that show was correct. They used to take wounded men, put a litter on the rungs, and fly them. Now, keep in mind here, medicine is getting better. In fact, the Army did a study after 1945. For every 100 wounded GIs that made it to doctor's care, the death rate was 4.5%. But Korea has a poor road system. You imagine a GI or a Marine who's badly wounded here, you stick them in a Jeep or a truck and you got to drive through those mountains to get them to a doctor? No. We put them on this little helicopter. The helicopter can fly over a river, over the trees, over the hills. It's a straight ahead shot to the doctor. When the war was over with, those helicopter pilots will save 9,315 GIs and wounded UN soldiers. The Army did a study. Because of the helicopter, for every 100 wounded GIs that made it to doctor's care, the death rate dropped to 2.5%. What do you think the Army's going to do with the helicopter after the Korean War? In fact, I'm sure you've seen this in your state of California. I'm sure, Richard, you've probably seen this in Texas. Isn't there occasionally a helicopter that takes somebody from a traffic accident on a highway to the hospital? Yeah, of course. Where does this come out of? The Korean War. Interesting what happened here. Well, I'll finish up here. Anybody have any questions or observations or points they want to make? We can do that.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, let's stop for a moment for announcements, and then we can open up to a question and answer. It's been a fascinating historical recounting of the Korean conflict and giving us so much historical context. I think a lot of us have known some of the facts, but the context that you gave of the parallel historical events are very, very important. So in terms of announcements, next week, this time, we'll be hosting Stan Smith, and Stan Smith will be speaking on, I'm going to need to pull this up for 1 second. Yes, Stan Smith will be speaking. The title of his presentation is The National Security State in the Biden Administration Lawfare Against Trump. So this gets into a very contentious contemporary issue, the Trump run for the presidency and the Democratic Party's pushback and what's going on there. But from Stan, what Stan will be addressing particularly is what does it mean for progressive forces? Is there a blowback for progressive forces? This should be a very interesting program. So please join us next Sunday at this time. And back to you, Mark. I'm going to go to gallery view and take questions. Now, to ask a question, and we ask you to make your comments about 2 minutes. And if they go over much more, we'll cut you off. But please don't put us in a position of having to cut you off. And either ask a question, or make a comment, or do both. And to do so, go to the bottom of your screen. There's a icon with a smiley face and a plus saying reactions. Use that to raise your hand electronically, and I will call people. I see two people. I'll just take them in the order I see them: Raj, Youssef, and Janet. So Raj, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Excellent. Very much learned a lot and enjoyed your style of presentation, which I find very interesting and very engaging. So thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of comments and then ask a question related to that. The Chinese forces were led by Lin Biao, or what we used to call Lin Piao, but it's, I think, pronounced Lin Biao. And the sole remaining son, Mao's children were sold from previous wives. Wives were killed. And so his last remaining son died in this war. And so for Mao, it was a horrible life. And Lin Biao was famous for advancing war techniques, during the Civil War, when he was fighting with the Japanese and with the Chiang Kai-shek's forces. He was famous for his new thing. So can you tell us a little bit about that? About how was he or was he not a brilliant commander and did something that was unexpected by the Americans? I mean, aside from what you told me. By the way, I knew a guy who was Marine, U.S. Marine, who was deployed in Incheon, and I went with him in South Korea to Incheon. Just a separate interesting tidbit.
Yeah.
So,
No, he was a good general. I mean, like Vo Win Giap, they're coming out of Asia. They're not European types. They're not American types. They're not Soviet either. And armor is not a big thing here. It's people power is what matters. But one of the decisive aspects about this is what, in fact, I've got that book in my insurgency collection, Mao's book on guerrilla warfare. And Mao had and they're all going to learn this. Lin Biao will learn this. Vo and Giap will learn this. Ho Chi Minh understood all this. He said that, when you start to build an army, a guerrilla army here, that's what this is. It's a guerrilla army, insurgency. People's war is what they're going to call it. And Americans did this during the American Revolution, and we don't talk about that in school. We leave that out, which I find particularly irksome. But Mao says in his book that when you start with a guerrilla group, let's say you have 20 people, if you're against 20 soldiers or 20 policemen, you don't attack them. If you have 20 and you're against 10, then you attack them. And he says you get their guns and you get their equipment and take it with you. He says over a period of time, and Mao also said, you don't have to go to West Point or Sandhurst to learn war. Anybody can learn war by doing it. And that's what Mao's going to do. That's where all of these people are. This is what all these people are going to do. Lin Biao's not going to be any different. He's not going to be any different at all. But what Mao did right, and this I always said was a decisive difference. He writes in his book that after these people get experience, the group gets larger. Finally, you're going to make that jump to become a conventional army. But you can't do it early because you'll get crushed. Mao also said something else that Lin Biao is going to take to heart. That once you get the people to support you, Mao writes in this book, the people are the sea, the guerrillas swim in that sea, and the people will support them. But he also says, how do you create the sea? And this is what Mao wrote, that when a Chinese communist guerrilla is not fighting, He helps the peasant plant his crops. He helps the peasant reap his crops. He helps the peasant fix his house. If he borrows something from the peasant, he returns it. If it's damaged, you fix it. If it's damaged too badly, you get him a new one. You don't abuse the peasant's wife. You don't abuse the peasant. This is not the doctrine that Chiang Kai-shek's going to follow. That's not what he's going to follow. And on top of that, the communists did better against the Japanese because of the fact they follow this doctrine. And so but at the same time, though, Chiang Kai-shek is not really for the people. He's for power. He wants power. Is what he wants. And his army abuses the people, which is why during the Chinese Civil War, not just platoons, not just companies, but at times battalions, regiments, and even divisions would change sides from the nationalists to the Eighth Root Army, the Communist Army. But they're all going to learn all this, Raj. And this is one of the reasons the North Korean army was highly successful on June 25, 1950, because they did this with the Chinese in China.
If I may be permitted just to follow up quickly, if they had so many tanks and the Americans didn't bring tanks, why did they have to escape? Why didn't they fight the Americans right there?
Oh, they did. They did. However, when that unfortunate Task Force Smith, they found out that the 2.75-inch bazooka that they were using, the shells would hit the T-34 and bounce off, and the tank's still going. They later found out that the 3.35-inch bazooka, that would knock it out. But in the beginning, they didn't send the big bazookas. They didn't send artillery. They didn't send a lot of artillery here because everybody thought, Raj, oh, the Americans are here. This is an Asiatic army, and Americans are going to turn this around. That's not what happened here. And I've even said this in Army Aviation Magazine. Two of the detriments that come out of this war, forget that it was a stalemate, is number one, the North Koreans beat Task Force Smith, and that was an embarrassment. And number two, ever since Thanksgiving night, November 25, 26, 1950, America has not won a war. I'm not going to count the Persian Gulf War. That was a 4-day cakewalk. And most of the wars we fought were what? Except for Korea, were what? Vietnam was, for the most part, a counterinsurgency. Afghanistan was what? A counterinsurgency. Iraq was, for the most part, what? A counterinsurgency. But take it a step further, what's going on in Ukraine right now? That's large-scale conventional war. Is it changing now? Maybe. Are Americans ready to insert their own people into Ukraine? I don't think so. So.
Okay, thank you. Our next person is Youssef. If you can mute yourself. Yeah, Youssef, if you could unmute yourself rather.
Oh. You cannot unmute, so you have to unmute everybody at this point. Best to unmute everybody.
Okay, can you unmute yourself now? I'm sorry.
Oh, yes.
Okay, good.
Thank
you.
Okay. No, I'll have other comments later, but maybe I should add that Korea was occupied by the Japanese, in fact, annexed by the Japanese, and effectively Manchuria was, although there was puppet government. So Kim Il-sung would also fought the Japanese in Korea. So he was a war hero. And my second comment about Giap, not only was he a master guerrilla tactician, he was also a master fixed point tactician in Dien Bien Phu, and later he used lavish cannon fire, and I think he had studied Napoleon and the Soviet tactics on that. So those were my comments, and if you have any comments on that.
Okay. Mark, I think
I've got,
okay,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah, I just turned, I've got Giap's book, and I've read his book more than once, People's Army, People's War. And it's a fascinating book to read. It truly is. But again, some of this is along the lines of what Mao was writing, who in turn, by the way, I didn't mention this before, was heavily influenced by Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, The Art of War, which is very much common sense. You know, the enemy's front is the enemy's front is his rear, the enemy's rear is his front, so on and so forth. Or if you're tangling with an enemy that's large, you retreat. If you're tangling with an enemy that's smaller, well, then you attack him. You attack him when he's asleep. You don't attack him when he's awake. You know, this is just common sense stuff that Mao's going to turn to his advantage, and so is Wen Jiap. So is, well, Ho Chi Minh too wasn't stupid when it came to this sort of thing. So it's fascinating, you know, the Oriental way of warfare as opposed to the West. Although Mao Zedong had a high regard, a very high regard for Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote the book on war in 1935. Very, very high regard for Clausewitz. Very high regard.
Thank you. Okay, so next on the stack is Janet, followed by Jean, followed by Richard. So Janet, please go.
Yeah, thank
Hello,
you.
Janet.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay.
Good.
Sort of. Well, as you probably know, yesterday, the Palestinians waged an SMO in occupied Palestine. And Palestinians have no military. So that's an interesting situation, which maybe at some future time, there'll be a program here, an analysis of what is going on there, went on there. Today is day 2. And there's, in the Bay Area, there's a protest at the Zionist, Israeli consulate in San Francisco, and I posted something in the chat about that today at 4 p.m. Pacific time. That said, so Mark, I may have misheard you, but I thought you said that the Soviets blew a hydrogen bomb in 1950 something?
1953.
Can
they
you
blew an atomic bomb in 1949.
Can
they
you
blew a hydrogen bomb in 53.
Can you talk about those two things?
Yeah, sure. You know, when the United States had the monopoly. In fact, I have said this in my classes that in 1945, you know, the globe's changed here. America has enjoyed unbridled power. You know, we like to think the United States was this real dominant power from 45. Some people still think now, but they haven't caught up. They haven't caught up with reality yet. But the window here, Janet, is short. 45 to 49. You know, America's got more food than it could eat, more money than it can spend, more gas than it can burn, and more clothes than it can wear, and it's got the bomb. But in 49, the Soviets blow a bomb. Now that domination is beginning to wear up. Beg your pardon?
Where?
In the Soviet Union, they tested an atomic bomb. Then they tested a hydrogen bomb in 1953.
So these are tests.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Correct. But what it showcases is America is not the lone superpower anymore. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, 89, 91, America again was that dominant power, but only for a short period of time. Because by the end of the 90s, getting into the 21st century here, again, the window's closing with the rise of China. Let's not count India out of this. Russia's still a competitor. Let's not forget Japan. They're number 3 on the list as in the global economic totem pole. And let's not forget the EU. You know, America is no longer that dominant country. We might think we are, but we're not. There's too many kibitzers in the game now. So absolute dominance came in short windows. 45 to 49, I'm talking absolute dominance. And even then, that term can be left out, absolute. But total dominance here, let's call it that. 45 to 49. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, again, that window was short. If you remember that terminology after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the peace dividend, you remember that? Yeah, what happened with that? No, it gave way to the neocon agenda. And we become no different than the Greeks, the Romans, the Brits, the French. We can go on with a list. We can go on with a list. But in a way, George Kennan was right. We don't want a major war. We just want to contain the Soviet Union. Now, will containment work now? No. It won't work. It won't work because China has a more superior economy than the Soviets did as a competitor. That's the difference. Interesting what you're seeing, what you've seen develop here since 1945. It's fascinating to see. It truly is. It truly is. And then my wife says, I hate talking to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for your contribution to the theory of multipolarity. We'll call it the Albertson corollary of too many kibitzers in the room.
In the game.
And our next person is Gene Rule.
Hello, Gene.
Hi. Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. This was great. And let me just add
tuning in.
Say again?
Thank you for tuning in.
Well, it's my Sunday morning, but I just want to add something, comment from my own experience when I was in the Marine Corps. What we were told is that Marines never retreat.
Right.
We do make strategic advances to the rear, however. So that was the phrase that I learned. And of course, the other thing,
in the terminology, Gene.
Well, that's one of the things I learned from the Marines. The other thing I learned was don't re-enlist, which I was never inclined to do. But again, I really appreciate your talk. The things that I know about, you covered very well. I really appreciate that. And there was a lot that I didn't know about, and I feel educated. So I thank you on that. But I guess the China issue is one issue that, yeah, I'm glad Janet brought that up. And but I wanted to ask about the atomic diplomacy and the decision to use the atomic bomb, because that was, some people have said it was horrified the whole world, the use of the atomic weapons, and we see it as not just the end to the World War II, but the beginning, opening salvos of the Cold War against, which was then an ally. Within months of Hiroshima, we started threatening our ally, the Soviet Union, that basically defeated Germany for us. So the whole question, because I understand the part of the reason for use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was because the Soviets were moving in and they were getting ready to advance, and the United States didn't want them to go any further, and they definitely did not want a co-occupation. They didn't want Soviet troops in Japan. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I sure can. You had two schools of thought here, Gene, going into like 1946, 47, 48, and 49. Paul Nietzsche, people like the Dulles brothers, Dean Acheson, are coming out with this line that Hitler's gone. Now we have a new Hitler. His name is Stalin. That's not true. That's not true. They were for militarizing American, more into militarizing American policy. Now Eisenhower's going to come along. He does not want a garrison state. He doesn't want another war like Korea. That's Eisenhower. Having said that, as opposed to Nietzsche, the Dulles brothers, Acheson, people like this, there's George Kennan and people like George Bolin. Kennan tried to explain that there is no new Hitler. He understood that the Soviet Union lost 25 million dead. He also understood that between that 70,000 villages and towns, Jane, that existed on June 21, 1941 in the Soviet Union were wiped off the map by May 7, 1945, in that 47-month horror show between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And out of the 25 million dead, Gene, 3/4, get this, 3/4 were men. Now, many of these men are between 20 and 45. Aren't these the guys that rebuild the roads? Aren't these the guys that rebuild the cities? Aren't these the guys that regenerate the population? Now, Oxford did a brilliant study on this, that between 1940 and 1941, for every 10 women, there were 9.1 men in the Soviet Union. But by 1945-46, Gene, for every 10 women, there is 6.5 men. This is why Kennan is arguing, no, Stalin's not going to start on a new round of conquest like Hitler did. He can't do it. What Stalin wants is to solidify his control on the East Bloc. That's mainly what he wants. And he wants that because he understands that in 1914, Germany invaded Russia, Tsarist Russia. And where'd he go through? Poland and Ukraine. The Poles invaded Russia, 1919, 1921. This precipitates the Russo-Polish War, which nobody talks about today. And Trotsky's Red Army throws them back. But in 41 is the big one. Hitler invades the Soviet Union through what? Poland and Ukraine. I mean, forget Stalin, Gene, for a moment. You think there are Russian people that want to get out of the East Bloc, Eastern Europe? No, because that's been a causeway of invasion. And let's not forget Napoleon, 1812. So Americans don't understand this. Russians do. Russia has been a causeway for invasion east-west for centuries, which is why Kennan is saying you can't build a NATO. You're going to raise those historical phobias among Russians. They're only going to counter it. And what did they come up with? The Warsaw Pact. So who's right here? Kennan or people like Nietzsche? Kennan was. And yet, he's not going to be director of State Department planning after 1949. They canned him. Nietzsche will be.
Thank you. So on this next on the stack is Richard Wright, followed by a return of Raj, and then I'll put myself on the stack. So Richard, if you can go, please.
Hello, Richard.
Hi there, Mark.
Yes, sir.
I live like just a couple of blocks from those hospital helicopters you're talking about. I hear them every other day. So my actually, Ann doesn't live very much further away than I do. there's a couple of issues that I wanted to bring up, and I think damn pen. One is that my understanding was that the people of South Korea, what was to become South Korea, basically supported Kim Il Sung.
Yeah.
You know, and his liberation, as they saw it, you know, at the time of the war, and that we very lately overlooked that. I mean,
Yes, we do.
And in fact, they had to be actively put down, suppressed in the support for an invasion, invading army, quote, invading army.
Right.
The other question I had is this: in Vietnam, one of the things that became, shall I say, was the military advisory groups, and their support and development of insurgency movements, counterinsurgency movements, actually, in Vietnam. And could as I put this in the chat, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit about it. Is we're doing exactly the same thing here in Ukraine. We've any number of officers who've died, quote, advising the Ukrainian military, and we're categorically unaware of this stuff. It's suppressed. Anyways, there's a couple of questions for you. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, the problem with the South Vietnamese man is that he's going to be the butt of attention by two armies: the VC,
yep,
the South Vietnamese generals. I mean, put yourself in his place. Although, going back to what you mentioned, because this has a bearing on it, go back to what you mentioned about the South Korean peasants favoring Kim Il Sung. That's true, because Kim Il Sung made sure the people up north kept their land, retained their land. Now, Syngman Rhee is not under that persuasion, and we support Syngman Rhee. So when Dean Rusk said that we didn't know that the Japanese and the Russians talked about the 38th parallel, and he's going to remark along the lines that, well, what are the Korean people going to think of us? They're not going to think of us any different than the Japanese and the Russians. Well, add to that, Syngman Rhee is not a proponent of making sure the people are keeping their land here like Kim Il Sung was up in the north. And so, in fact, what's left out too is, in fact, talk to some American veterans of this war. They found that some of the South Korean peasants had joined the North Korean army and were shooting at Americans. That's left out of the narrative too. But when you fast forward to Vietnam, in the beginning in particular, Ho Chi Minh and his cadres, he's inserting in these South Vietnamese villages. They're going to make sure that the South Vietnamese villagers in the areas they control retain their land. So who's going to join the VC and who's going to join the South Vietnamese army? It's no accident that even those American advisors you were talking about, they're testing the helicopter in 1962 and 1963 in Vietnam, but they're not moving American troops. They're moving South Vietnamese troops into these battle zones against the VC. And there's reports, I've seen them in my magazine. There's reports coming home that are saying that the South Vietnamese troops, many of them, lack that intestinal fortitude to engage the enemy. The idea of moving troops by helicopter is working, but the people you're dropping off now are not really hard fighters. So who are they going to say is going to have to replace the South Vietnamese troops? They're saying this in 1963, 64. Who are they going to say? It's going to take American troops. Okay, what happened in 1965? And that's where it's going to go. but you've got two armies trying to enlist the same people. I mean, put yourself in that situation as a South Vietnamese man, 18, 19, 20 years old. That's not a situation to be in. It's not a situation to be in. So
Thank you. So the next person on the stack, and we have a tradition, and Raj, I'm sure, understands that, is that if someone who hasn't yet spoken, they get to the top of the stack. So Ann Lewis will be the next person, followed by Raj, followed by myself, followed by Yusuf.
Okay, thank you. I'm in the maybe unenviable position of looking at a lot of mainstream documentaries, and there's been a whole trend of documentaries about human rights violations in other countries. That's one of the big themes of these very expensive mainstream documentaries. And one of them that I looked at fairly recently was about missionaries in North Korea, or a missionary in South Korea who's rescuing people from North Korea because of human rights stuff. By the way, there were also films about the same kind of idea in Tunisia and Uganda. So, this seems to be a trend, and a little bit scary trend in the media. But anyway, one of the things in this film about North Korea, which gave me no understanding of what the actual conditions are in North Korea, and I'd love to hear more about that, but was that the Chinese were even meaner than the North Koreans in terms of human rights violation of people trying to flee across the border and imprisonment of people. So it was expressing a Chinese presence in North Korea, on the ground presence in North Korea. I just wanted to know any comments you might have about that.
yeah, in taking a look at China here, after the Second World War, there was the discussions, are the French going to go back or not to North Vietnam? And the French will eventually go back. But in the meantime, Chinese troops occupied the north, British troops occupied what we call South Vietnam. But this is a Chinese army overseen by Chiang Kai-shek. And they are looting North Vietnam mercilessly. And Ho tells the Vietminh, don't shoot back, because he doesn't want them here. If we shoot back, they're going to stay here. If we don't shoot back, they're going to leave. Now, that's a tough decision to make when they're looting your country. Keep in mind, there were 180,000 Chinese troops in North Vietnam just to hold this till the French came back. And eventually they go and the French come in. In North Korea, let's face it, many of the people in the Chinese army, when it was a nationalist army, were peasants too. And so do they have a lot at home? No. So when they go in these other countries, are they going to loot? Yeah. The Soviets did the same darn thing in Eastern Europe. You know what's interesting, Ann? When you talk to American World War II vets, and I've talked to a lot of them, they'd go through a French village. You think Americans weren't looting French villages? They were. Tea sets, knives and forks. One guy told me he saw somebody stealing a grandfather clock. Yet, when the Soviets looted a village in Eastern Europe as they're advancing into Nazi Germany, you know what they would steal? Americans would never do this. Brits would never do this. Light bulbs. Because their families at home didn't have enough light bulbs. That's if they had electricity. They're stealing light bulbs. All armies all over the world loot. You can't stop it. They're going to loot. I don't care who they are. They're going to loot. And is that hard for the people they're looting from? Yeah, it sure is. Is there anything you can do about it if you're one of those people being looted? No, because they got the guns. You don't. That's a problem. That's a problem. So they all do it. They all do it. They all loot.
Yeah, my question is more about current. What's going on there now in terms of Chinese presence on the ground in North Korea?
Well, China, this is the China of 2023. not 1950. They don't want a war. The problem with the kid they've got up there, I mean, let's understand something. Do you really think North Korea is really communist? You've had Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il. That's nepotism. Grandfather, father, son. That's not in the Communist Manifesto. That doesn't exist. This is not a communist state. It's a dictatorship, simple, pure and simple. Yet, it's a Peking client state. And so does Peking try to keep control of this? Yes. Are they really going to be concerned what methods they're going to use? No, because look who you're dealing with. That kid. That kid. Now, if it wasn't for China, that whole place might just fall apart. I mean, these people are dirt poor. Many of them are. And so it's a tough country. It's a tough country. Yeah, don't think we weren't doing the same thing to some of our clients. I mean, look what we did in Central and South America, for Pete's sakes. With the bananas like coming out of El Salvador and Guatemala. Big powers do this. They all do it. They all do it. Why? Because they got the power to do so. That seems to be human nature, the human condition. The human condition. Interesting.
Raj?
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to ask you a question about Eisenhower's when you said he didn't want a garrison state, and I've heard this military-industrial complex he warned and so forth. But wasn't it during Eisenhower's administration that they actually wanted to bomb both Russia and China with simultaneous nuclear bombings of almost 500 cities? So how, if he was against garrison state, wouldn't that require a huge military-industrial complex? Of course, with nuclear, that means Air Force and nuclear bombs. It requires enormous infrastructure to do that. And so Eisenhower is given a lot of credit for not wanting a garrison state, and he was, military. But Eisenhower himself was an instrument of imperialism. So how do you explain all this? How do you rationalize all this? How do you analyze it?
Yeah, after the Korean War, he didn't want a garrison state from the perspective of building up a huge conventional army. That's why he reduced the army from 20 divisions to 14. He reduced the Navy. The Navy didn't like it, but they did. The only thing that went up, Gene, was the Air Force. Why? They're getting those new bombers, the B-47, the B-50. The B-52 has been around a long time. And the B-52. You don't quite have the triad developed where you're going to have, the strategic bombers, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then the nuclear submarines, which form that nuclear triad. That's rather primitive at this point. So the point service here is the Air Force. They're going to get the money. They're going to get the strategic bombers, and because they really control most of the nuclear weapons, which is why you are seeing at the same time, Raj, at the same time, and I've got this in some of the back issues of the magazine I work at, where they are, and the Army, okay, if you're going to reduce us, then give us the 280 millimeter artillery piece that would fire a battlefield nuclear shell. Now the Army's going to get this, and they are practicing, Raj, believe it or not, in 1954, 1955, 56, 57, 58, on fighting on a nuclear battlefield in Europe. And they're going to develop the helicopter and light planes to move people around. That's what they're doing here. But at the same time, he doesn't want a large army. He feels that's going to turn us into a garrison state. The last thing he wants is something what Trump wanted in June of 2020, if you remember. He petitioned Mark Milley. He didn't want the National Guard and police on the streets to clean the streets of Washington. He wanted the 10th Mountain Division. He wanted the 82nd Airborne. He wanted the 101st Airborne. That voids Posse Comitatus of 1878. And Milley, what did Milley tell Trump? No. So this is something that Eisenhower didn't want. But at the same time, with that new look defense, they're going to have something known as massive retaliation. And you remember what the old Air Force adage was, well, if somebody gets out of line, we'll bomb them back into the Stone Age.
But that is just, I just want to ask you that, but that also creates military industrial complex, except it's in the air. So
Right.
Eisenhower, basically, when he's given credit for speaking against it, it's really not a correct assessment. He just wanted reduced soldier force, those kind of thing. But Air Force is part of military industrial complex, and he boosted it. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, that credit's limited, of course. You're in a brand new America now.
Yeah.
And that defeat in North Vietnam and that stalemate in Korea has really impacted the United States here. Has really, and again, even MacArthur is going to say, don't get involved in a land war in Asia. Too late for him to say that, but he says that after all is said and done. So
Thank you.
interesting.
Okay, thank you. So we have a number of people on the stack right now. I'm going to insert myself, as I said before, followed by Rich Johnson, and then Jean, Youssef, and Richard Wright. And I really encourage people who haven't commented or asked questions to join the discussion. But Mark, I wanted to ask you a segue from this, your comments about the conditions for people living in North Korea today, and how onerous they are and how poor they are. As you pointed out, the war is not over; it's stalemated, but
Right.
the war goes on, and it's a war that is deadly as a shooting war because of sanctions, particularly against North Korea. These sanctions take a huge toll in lives. They make life very, very difficult. It is very similar to a war type situation. In fact, the expression that we use now is hybrid war, because these coercive economic measures have substituted in many cases, with almost 40 countries in the world right now under these type of coercive economic situations, really impacting people. And so I wanted to see what your thoughts were of two aspects of that. One is a big question. What is the strategy for ending the sanctions against Korea? That's the first type of question. And then the other one is the confounding part that where most of these sanctions are unilateral, the U.S. against official enemies. In the case of Korea and 14 other countries right now, the sanctions are multilateral. They're approved by the UN. And it seems that there's a mechanism, and hopefully you can go into that, of why that mechanism is kind of one-way elastic. You can wage an economic war against the country, but you can't end it. And so if you could comment on those questions about the current situation and the potential for relieving the suffering in the Democratic People's Republic, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because of the fact that perhaps maybe one way to relieve the sanctions is to finally sit down and have a peace treaty. Maybe that's a way to go. Remember when Trump said he was going to sit down and have a peace treaty? That, of course, him and Kim fell out of love. If you remember when he said we fell in love, so they fell out of love. That didn't work, I guess. That could be also one way, if you have honest negotiations, if that's even possible, to maybe try to change North Korea from being, solely a Chinese ally, to perhaps try to draw them to the West. to help the economy here. Now, one thing I will say is, are you going to have to bring South Korea into this? Probably, because if you remember what happened to Germany once the Soviet Union collapsed, that the Germans had to pay to jumpstart the East Germans to catch up with the West Germans. That cost West Germany a lot of money to create that country, Germany. The other side, you know how much it would probably cost South Korea to get the people in North Korea to play catch up here? Now having a Korean state would probably mean the end of the sanctions. Is that possible at this stage? No, probably not. Probably not. But as long as the war goes on, that's a guarantee here. A virtual guarantee. As long as the war goes on, this kid is going to use what the United States Air Force did to North Korea during the Korean War to instill that fear into a people which he controls the media. This is why we have to have a 1 million-man army today, not an army of 190,000 men, which is why he's also engaging in nuclear weapons. And on top of that, let's look at it from his side. Keep in mind, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became the world's third largest nuclear weapons power. And when they agreed to give up those nuclear weapons with the Budapest Memorandum, the signers of that agreement, Britain, London, Moscow, and Washington, all agreed we would help Ukraine maintain their sovereignty. That we wouldn't meddle in them politically. We would help that they would be able to maintain their structural integrity and their political sovereignty. What happened with that? So North Korea, and let's add Pakistan, Israel, and Iran to this, the big powers, you can't trust them. So that's going to maintain the sanctions because we're going to be at odds with the North Koreans. So I don't think the sanctions are going to be relieved here. And is that going to mean North Korea is going to be dependent on China for a lot of what they need? Yeah, there is. Yeah, they will. And so the sanctions are a weapon the United States uses against a lot of countries because for whatever the reason, they don't kowtow to the American agenda. And one of them is going to be North Korea. When is it 1/4 of the world is facing U.S. sanctions? That's a lot of countries. And don't think some of those countries won't contemplate joining BRICS after next January of next year.
Okay, thank you. Rich Johnson, followed by Gene, Youssef, and Richard Wright.
Thank you.
Richard.
Whoever that is. Okay, so here's my questions, my comments. Let's see. I actually wrote things down if I can make sense out of them. So first, I'm going to start with, I guess. Well, I want to say a couple things. One is you talked about the nature or the bad habit of the victors after a war, stripping everything they can from wherever the military still is. It's just the nature of the side that wins to strip everything they can as they leave, like you said, light bulbs, for instance, going back from Europe back towards the east. But then you also said earlier that I think it's because of Mao's or the time when Mao was in power, where the Chinese were told that the Chinese military, in my words, to treat the people that they were guests of, where they'd won the war against them, to essentially treat them like family. In other words, break something, fix it. You can't fix it, replace it, all that kind of stuff. So it seems like it for one moment that it was they were able, I guess, to treat the people right and not just take advantage of them. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I wanted to say was that
just through a quirk of, I'm not going to go into the whole story. I can talk about it for hours. When I was 16 years old, I just got into a jazz band in my hometown in the Valley in California, and I didn't know 4 months later that the band was going to be going on a 6-week trip to Japan, Okinawa, Hawaii, and Korea. I didn't know anything about any of those places. My dad lived through World War II, so I got to grow up with him, and that's about all I knew about war. And this was 1961. So I got to go to the 38th parallel. And then I was wondering, well, why are they taking, what's the 38th parallel? Well, I sort of saw, knew there was a line between the North and the South. That's about all I knew. I didn't know we were still at war, that we hadn't really finished. But that moment, being in all those Asian countries, Hawaii to Asian countries, totally changed my world outlook without me having any clue what it meant. It changed me from being what I call innocent little white boy from 16 years old from my hometown into as far as I'm concerned, the beginning of anti-imperialist.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So I just want to say I got to watch Korea rebuild 8 years after the 53. And then the last thing that I guess I want you to speak to that question about the distinction.
For about 4 minutes, and if
I'm sorry, Roger.
please.
I'm depending on you to let me know. If you just speak to that question about the difference between Mao and everywhere else in the world, what you said essentially was everything contradicting what you said. I'd just like to understand a little better. Thank you.
Yeah, that's another good question. Mao wrote this in his book on guerrilla warfare, and he was actually he's actually countering what the nationalist army was doing in China. He was directing this toward the Chinese guerrilla to also regard the Chinese peasant. That's what he's doing. He didn't want his guerrillas looting Chinese peasantry, because his recruits are coming from where? The Chinese peasantry. In fact, you can find rudiments of this in the American colonies down south with Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion. It's the same sort of thing. These people who lived down in the Carolinas and Georgia would give Sumter and people like Francis Marion information. They'd give them shirts, they'd give them pants, they'd give them shoes, they'd give them the occasional gun. Well, the Chinese peasant is doing the same thing to Mao. And so you get this relationship with the citizenry, and you don't want your men abusing the citizenry. You don't want that. So that gets the citizenry on your side. However, sometimes when you go into a different country, maybe you don't have that regard for their citizenry. And especially if that army is made up of people who, when they go home, they don't have a lot. So are they going to loot? Yeah, they are going to loot. I mean, I don't care. I don't care if it's Americans. I don't care if it's Canadians or Brits. They all do it. Whether in a large way or a small way, they're going to loot. It's just, and to me, though, part of that is a lack of command. All right, well, we're in this country. I don't want you looting anybody, and leave the women alone. Okay. A good commander will do that. A good commander will do that. And I know some American commanders from the Second World War who would do that. Leave the women alone. Don't loot the people. We want them helping us against the Japanese. Okay, how hard is that to figure out? Shouldn't be. So, interesting.
Okay. Thank you. Next up are some repeat people, Jean, and then Yusef, and Richard.
Okay, well, again, it's been a very interesting discussion, and we've shifted gears a little bit. I kind of wanted to raise the issue of China. We talked about some aspects of China, but it's a different animal right now. China is now a superpower, and there are people that say it's a new kind of superpower, because the old superpowers always gain their power by military force and conquest. And some people say, well, China hasn't done that. It's fought a couple border skirmishes with Vietnam, India, Russia, but it hasn't engaged in any massive wars. And instead, it's engaged, it has ended poverty at home, it's ending poverty elsewhere. They have the Belt and Road Initiative because they're, telling 20 Latin American countries have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. And in Africa, it said, China has never enslaved a single African. Instead, they're building railroads and so forth. So it's a new kind of superpower, which is going to change the dynamics of world geopolitics. And I wonder what your reaction to this set of ideas is. I'm still kind of trying to grapple with it myself and try to understand it. But I wonder what your comments are. Thank you.
Yeah, you know something, Gene? I can't be sure if this is really the case, but it's kind of an extension of what we were just talking about. Mao saying, "Don't abuse the peasant's wife, don't abuse the peasant," so on and so forth. And so when you take this, out of the guerrilla context, it's still a better treatment of people. Okay, well, let's spread our economic largesse overseas. I mean, go back to what Kennan even said. Let's contain the Soviet Union because our economy is better. And Kennan said, our political alternative is more palatable than Moscow's. But we have to push that agenda. China's doing that. And so when America first came on the world scene as a power, I'm sure you had the Spanish-American War, and I'll agree with that. But America after that war is pushing the American economy. It's pushing the American dollar. We are gonna undermine the British pound, and our dollar is going to become the world's reserve currency. Now, is that where China's going to go here in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? One would think so. One would think so. And another thing too about mentioning about BRICS, some countries in January are going to vote to join BRICS. Saudi Arabia might be one of them. Venezuela might be another. Cuba might be another. So you're seeing another block of countries that maybe go along with the Chinese agenda here. And China, again, is pushing this economically, really, not militarily. Not militarily. So are they somewhat following what the United States was doing here in the early 20th century? To a certain extent, they are, because that's what the United States was doing. Of course, the situation is not quite the same in the early 20th century. You're seeing the developing collapse here, Gene, of the European dominance of the world. We don't have that now. We can't add that in here. You're seeing a basic repeat, but it's not exact. I always say history repeats, but it's not exact. It never is. But you keep seeing, though, basically, Gene, the decline of one great power and then the rise of another trying to fill the void. What you're seeing now is and America's declining. Some people don't like me to say this. We are declining. We are on a downward path. Who seems to be on an upward path? China. Of course, talk to some Americans, what the China professes they're supposed to be, they don't like. Well, do you think back at the end of the 19th century, there were people in Europe who wanted to see the United States take control of the globe? I don't think so. There were still some Tories calling us that grimy thumbprint of a republic that they were calling us in 1812, for Pete's sakes. So, but the globe goes through these changes. And so is China looking for its place under the sun? Yeah. How is it doing it? Basically economically. Are they building a larger military? Yeah, that goes with the territory. But are they doing it basically economically? Yes. That's what we did. And then the military follows. But that's what the Chinese are doing. It seems to be a script. Because keep in mind too, and you can go back over history and see this. They're building a larger navy, which, by the way, so is India. They're building a larger navy. And when people build large navies, they are looking to expand influence beyond their borders. This has been going on for centuries. And what is it again? Man. Doesn't make any difference where they come from.
Yeah.
There are variations, yes, but it's still man.
Can I just maybe a redirect, because I know, yes, China has a big navy and all this, but there are those that say, and I think I'm probably one of them, that it's geared toward protecting its own. It's there to protect Taiwan from, a part of China from US imperialism moving in. And so its purpose is, again, to protect its own, not to expand into other countries.
And interesting what you're saying here. It conforms with that book, and I'm looking at it right now. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mann, when he said, if you want to keep an enemy from your shores, forget forts along the coast. It's too late. Build yourself a navy to keep the opposing navy out to sea. Interesting.
Okay.
And don't think the Chinese military hasn't read that book, Gene. Don't think they haven't. They have. I'll bet you they have.
They are well-read, disciplined people. Yes.
Of course they are. They wouldn't be where they are if they weren't disciplined.
Right. Absolutely.
And that denotes organization.
Okay, we're gonna start wrapping things up with Youssef, followed by Richard.
Yes, thank you. A quick comment. First, a quick comment. China doesn't have any.
You're going to the dogs.
China doesn't have any troops in North Korea, at least uniformed troops. So I think the issue was the Chinese preventing North Korean economic refugees. I think there were complaints about that. Okay, so my point is about Turkey. Turkey entered late under a conservative government into the North Korean War. They were put in the very front, and soon this coincided with the counteroffensive by North Korea and China, and the UN troops US and UN troops were given the retreat order. This was not communicated to the Turkish troops. The Turkish troops were very disciplined. They obeyed blindly. They did their job. They really fought well, one must admit, and suffered enormous casualties. Meanwhile, the US troops withdrew relatively unscathed. At least much less worse off. So later, this was blamed on a communications failure, technical failure. Thank you, sorry, thank you very much. And the Turks didn't, as you always remind us, didn't go over to the North Koreans.
Right.
But later, this was a source of resentment being used as cannon fodder. The second in command of the Turkish troops was the leader of a 1960 coup that resulted in more democracy, actually. But anyway, one of the first acts was to remove Turkish troops from Korea. And this was the first time that Turkey had defied the United States, and the US ambassador was pestering the junta, was told by the leader in Turkish in very coarse terms. The interpreter might have softened it. Anyway, later this leader of the coup, he didn't make himself, he wasn't made president. he was the nucleus of a left-wing coup in Turkey a few years later. And it was this was partly this, I should say, greatly contributed to the upsurge of anti-NATO upsurge in Turkey in the 1960s. So that was my comment.
Number one, just so you know, you folks, I left my email addresses in the chat. So if you have a question or comment afterwards, shoot it. Shoot it. I'll address it. If something comes up that you didn't think of now, send it. But yeah, you know something though, the Turks, interesting. 200 when I saw an army study, 226 Turks were captured by the Red Chinese and the North Koreans. And none of them turned. You know, they couldn't, the brainwashing techniques didn't work on the Turks.
Yes, they obeyed, they were given an order and they were really steadfast in following that order. It probably won't take place, repeat now, but that was, then the army had the, whether Mehmet likes it or not, had a great, very respected reputation, and Turkey came from military tradition. That's
plus a lot of these Turkish troops came from the same village or the same collection of villages, and the families knew each other. So if you went over to China, how do you think your family's going to be treated at home? That's interesting. That's not the United States. You can have somebody from Connecticut in a Texas division. Although I don't think today some Connecticut people would want to be in a Texas division, but I'm just making that point.
Okay, Richard Wright.
Okay, so this is very late in the the talk to bring this up, but you know, do with it what you will. Early on, you mentioned one of the things that came out of the Korean conflict was a helicopter.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing in Ukraine now are a couple of things. One is, of course, the use of drones as being a cheap form of grenade launching. The other issue is hypersonic weapons, of which I believe the Russians have the lead on this. The United States is apparently lagging sorely behind that.
Yeah, playing catch up.
Yeah, could you comment on? I mean, after all, these are new industrial weapons. You know, we're still looking at things in terms of nuclear weapons.
Right.
These hypersonics are a game changer in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
Could you maybe address that a little bit, Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, when again going back to the drones just for a moment, you know, some of the old issues of Army Aviation magazine, when I go back into them, I see the first time that the Army's really using drones. I mean, compare what you're seeing in 1954 or 55 with what you're seeing today. It's like comparing a 2023 Lexus to a 54 Ford. I mean, there's no comparison, but this is the evolution of technology. You're seeing the same thing here with hypersonic weapons. You had supersonic weapons, now you got hypersonic weapons.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to be the firstest with the mostest is actually what you're seeing here. So again, these and Ukraine is like the Spanish Civil War in a way, Richard. It's a test ground. Mm-hmm. That's what this is. Mm-hmm. The Soviets tested some of their tanks in Spain. They tested some of their planes in Spain. So did fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. You know, they're using the Spanish in 36 to 39, and that's just a tune-up for 1939. And so my contention here is that, of course, Ukraine is a war that's going to go on for a while. That war is not going to end tomorrow. It's not going to end next week, and it's not going to end next month. It's not going to end next month. One reason is Americans don't want to fight anymore. That army in Ukraine is now our army. We're spending billions in Ukraine and only millions in Maui.
Yeah.
Who rates higher on the appropriations list? Ukrainians or Hawaiians? That's our army. Because one reason a lot of Americans don't want to fight anymore. You know, this is not 1963. This is 2023, when you could get Americans to go into the jungles of Vietnam. You're not going to get a lot of Americans who are going to want to go to the Dnieper River. You're going to have to explain to them what's for me here on the Dnieper River. And what is for them there? Nothing. Nothing. So this is, again, this is not 1963, it's 2023. So that army we are supporting is our army. And it depends on how long these Ukrainians, before they come out of the ether, know that they're fighting for the United States and they're not fighting for Kiev.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our 2-hour period. So I think we could start to wrap things up. Mark, I'd like to give you the opportunity to make some sort of final comments, if you would like to. You started off with the stalemate and ended up with the stalemate at the 38th parallel, but also a lot of things have changed in East Asia militarily. Maybe you could comment a little about the current military configuration of East Asia, where you mentioned a little bit about Japan, now the third largest economy in the world, and slated by official Japanese policy to become the third largest military force in the world, a major game changer, and one that people don't really look at very much. You mentioned the role of India, which is now has military alliances with the United States, and is now the most populous country in the world, one of the largest economies. So we have a stalemate at the 38th parallel, but we also have a very changing military situation. Please sum up.
Yeah, I mean, if this war in Korea is really over, then how come 30,000 American troops are still on the 38th parallel? That's a question I always ask when I get people saying, well, you know, it's I said, well, how come they're still there? The other side of the coin here is, and I brought this up at the last Peace Council meeting 2 weeks ago, Japan. The Japanese defense budget last year was 43 and a change billion dollars. That's what it was last year. The Ministry of Defense now, and this is a big increase. You know, by our standards, you might say, well, that's only 53 billion. They're asking for 53.8 billion. That's a large increase from having a defense budget of 43 billion last year. That's a big increase. So what does that tell you about Japan? You don't think China's not going to see this? The Japanese are looking to add 12 Mogami-class frigates to the Japanese Navy. They are also looking to upgrade. They want to buy some more F-35s. They want to buy more missiles to arm those F-35s. They are going to extend their amphibious warfare capabilities. In fact, they were training with the United States in amphibious warfare training exercises in the Philippines. So you can see where this, and Japan, according to their constitution, is not supposed to devote more than 1% of the gross domestic product to arms. And that seems like they are violating that. And they're going this, and if they are, they're going the same route we are. Do presidents go before Congress and ask for a declaration of war anymore? Does Congress really have power of the purse? Or is it the unelected officials that have power of the purse that make up the military, industrial, financial, security, congressional complex? And China is growing its military, and that's understandable. And so, but power, it's economic power in the end. And that seems to be moving from the West to the East. And another thing to keep an eye on is what's going on here internally with regards to debt ceiling discussions, government shutdowns. Remember, Fitch Credit Rating Agency lowered America's debt rating from AAA to AA and AA plus. Now, they're the only one that did that. But one of the reasons they said they did that, they're telling their investors, maybe America's not that place you want to invest your money with these government shutdowns, debt ceiling discussions, and the growing debt. So it's interesting how all of this, the economics in particular, molds this discussion we're really talking about. It's the economy in the end. China doesn't seem to be having a debt ceiling discussion. They don't seem to be having a government shutdowns. America is. So is this a selling point on the systems themselves? There's a question for you. Does the American system work? Or does Peking's system work or Beijing's system work? Is that what they're going to use to be selling bricks? I mean, watch, see what happens here. It's fascinating to see. And then my wife says, I hate talking to you.
Thank you. And it's been a fascinating program. As always, when you come and help us understand world politics and geopolitics. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. And please join us next week to hear Stanfield Smith talk about the Democrat and Trump conflict and what it means for the left. Have a good day.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.